Preacher was an old black feller that worked the LS range up near Tascosa, up in that Canadian River country I told you about. Now, he was mighty interesting to me because in the course of his life he'd been a slave, a mule skinner building roads, a cook on an ocean-going ship, but I knew him best as a cowboy, and a darn good one at that. They called him Preacher because he was always talking about the Almighty and heaven and hell and such, and he rode an old bay mule he called Deacon. The other fellers respected Preacher as a top hand, but they kind of shied away from him because, to tell you the truth, he made their conscience a little bit sore and ouchy. But I used to love to hear his tales. He told about Noah and his great ship and how Moses beset the Pharaoh of Egypt with locust plagues and pest, and how Abraham was going to kill his own boy, but God stopped him just in time. And then he told me about the man called Jesus. Sermonizing carpenter, he called him, son of the master, who went around making the lame to walk and the blind to see, only to be lynched by the very folks he was trying to help. I didn't savvy that, not at all, but Preacher said, son, that's the way it was meant to be. He'd say, for greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for a friend. That's what Preacher said, but he did more than just say those words. He lived by them. Preacher and I were out prowling one night, just jogging along, headed back to camp, when we heard this beller from down near the Canadian River. Well, we rode down and found a calf bogged down in the mud in a little backwater. Well, being the youngest, I volunteered to go down and make the rescue, which I did with little trouble. I just reached down and pulled that little dauber out of the mud and laid him across the saddle in front of me. Well, when I went to back old Sancho out, he had bogged down too. He backed into a branch and goosed and jumped right in the middle of that red rolling hell of a river. Before I could even kick my feet out of the stirrups, an undercurrent caught us, and there we were, me and a 1,000-pound horse on the bottom of that river, and he was on top. I kicked and pulled and strained for the longest time, but it wasn't no use. I thought the end was coming for sure, when all of a sudden a pair of mighty, powerful hands reached down and grabbed me by the belt and wrenched me free. Next thing I knew, I was bobbing to the surface, gasping for breath. I floated downstream a ways and grabbed me a clump of grass and pulled myself up on the bank, and while I lay there getting my wind and my wits about me, I became strangely aware that Preacher, Deacon, Sancho, and the calf, they were all gone. I run up and down the bank calling Preacher's name, but no answer. I walked back to camp and I told the boys what had happened, and they said, son, don't you worry. Preacher's been and worse jackpots than that. He'll be along here directly. You just wait and see. Well, Sancho did come in later that night, and I was mighty grateful for that, but Preacher never did. Next morning, we went back down to the river and rode the bank for several miles on either side, and all we found was a set of mule tracks leading off into that water, and the way those tracks were spread out, it's plain that mule was moving on. One of the boys took a plank off the wagon and drove it in the sand there, and he took his knife and he carved Preacher and Deacon crossed over here. Since I was the closest to Preacher, the boys asked me to say a few words. Preacher was a good man. He saved my life. There's a song he always sang. Precious memories, unseen angels, fly across the lonely years. How they linger ever near me in fond memories appear. Precious memories, how they linger, how they they ever flood my soul. In the stillness of the midnight, precious sacred scenes unfold. Well, we best get around. There's work to be done.